Okay, so I did my presentation on the tetanus vaccine. Now, before we talk about the tetanus vaccine, we need to understand tetanus as a disease. So, tetanus is a disease also known as lockjaw, and it's caused by the Clostridium tetani bacteria. Now, this bacteria is found mostly in agricultural settings. This might be in soil, dust, and animal droppings. Oftentimes, we hear the old saying, don't step on a rusty nail because you will get tetanus. But a common misconception associated with this is that the rust itself leads to tetanus infection. But this is not true at all. The tetany bacteria is very abundant in nature, and the fact that a nail is rusty suggests that the nail has been exposed to nature and its elements. Moreover, the fact that nails are pointy means the skin might be punctured and elements might enter the body, namely tetany bacteria or spores of the bacteria. Now, once the bacteria has entered your body, the toxin, TENT, or tetanospasmin, impedes our nervous system and prevents inhibitory neurons from functioning properly. Thus, muscle spasms are a result and seizures happen in severe cases. And here we have a graphic of the tetany bacteria. And notice there's a little bulge right here. This bulge is its endospore, and we will talk about that in the next slide. So, the tetany bacteria create endospores or dormant offspring. Now, these dormant offspring allow the bacteria to persist in harsh conditions, and the endospores germinate when conditions are right. So, oftentimes, when a person contracts tetanus, they initially contract a tetany bacterium in its spore form, and the spore germinates in the body because the conditions are much more favorable there. And here we have the graphic. You see the tetany bacteria without its spore, and it exhibits that classic rod shape. And with its spore, we see more of a drumstick shape because we have this terminal spore at its terminal end. So the tetany bacteria is gram-positive, and it is anaerobic, preferring environments with little to no oxygen, such as the ground, dirt, or even in our body. Additionally, only mature tetany bacteria actually produce that toxin, and a potential mechanism for contracting tetanus may sound a little bit like this. A person steps on a rusty nail covered in tetany spores. Now, the wound is deep enough to puncture a blood vessel, and the tetany bacteria are able to enter that blood vessel or lymphatic vessel, and they germinate in that favorable environment. And the secreted toxins from this mature C. tetani bacteria are able to travel towards our nervous system. And once in our nervous system, they block certain inhibitory neurotransmitter vesicles and cause continual muscle contractions, or like I said before, possibly even seizures. So now we're going to trace the pathway of the toxin. So tetanus, like I said before, only becomes dangerous when the tetanus toxin makes its way to the nervous system. And it's important to note that the bacterium itself is not inherently dangerous. Really, it's only the toxin that is dangerous, specifically that toxin once it makes its way in our nervous system. So now we're going to talk about that toxin as it makes its way to our nervous system. So first, it binds to our receptor in our presynaptic cleft. So here we see that receptor right here, and we see the toxin right next to it. So now this complex enters the neuron, and once the receptor detaches from the toxin, and the toxin then navigates through our central nervous system and seeks a inhibitory neuron. And with that inhibitory neuron, it finds its way towards the axon terminal, and there are vesicles filled with GABA neurotransmitters. And these GABA neurotransmitters are responsible for stopping the release of acetylcholine in neighboring neurons. So here we see GABA potentially would attach to these and stop acetylcholine release. But what happens is this toxin binds to this membrane protein known as synaptobrevin. Now, this synaptobrevin is responsible for allowing the vesicle to leave the axon terminal and bind to these receptors. But since this membrane protein is cleaved, the vesicle is not able to release its neurotransmitters. So without inhibitory control, there is excessive excitation of muscle motor neurons and muscles continue to contract. And that is the characteristic of tetanus. This is what makes tetanus so dangerous, not being able to control our muscles. So now that we know a lot about the disease and how it functions, we can now talk about the vaccine. So the vaccine of tetanus utilizes something called a toxoid. So a toxoid is simply a toxin in its deactivated form, and introduction of this toxoid triggers an immune response when B cells recognize the particle as foreign. Now, the production of antibodies follow, and these antibodies circulate the bloodstream. Additionally, memory cells are produced, and subsequent infections are recognized and attacked. The tetanus vaccine is also administered typically as a combination vaccine. So we will see diphtheria and pertussis there as well. Interestingly, tetanus is the only disease of the three that is not highly contagious, as the only vector of transmission for tetanus is, like I said before, through the bacteria spore or the bacteria itself entering your bloodstream, secreting that toxin, and that toxin infiltrating your nervous system. So it's kind of a stepwise process. So how is TENT produced? Well, first, a culture of C. tetani is inoculated in an aqueous medium, and the culture is allowed to grow for a certain time. Then the bacteria itself is removed from the overall culture, and we only have the toxin TENT remain. And this TENT toxin is neutralized. It is not going to be harmful to us anymore because we treat it with formaldehyde. Now, this toxin in its inactivated form is then treated with aluminum and calcium salts. These aluminum and calcium salts act as a sort of preservative. They increase the shelf life, and they are used in many vaccines and are proven to not be harmful. So we don't have to worry about other things being in that vaccine besides just the toxoid. So a little bit more on the safety of the vaccine. So the vaccine only contains the deactivated toxin because of that treatment with formaldehyde. Also, bacteria is entirely removed from that equation. And for these reasons, the bacteria is entirely harmless. The vaccine is entirely harmless. And if any symptoms do exist, they are very mild. So some examples of symptoms you might get from receiving the tetanus vaccine, and I'm sure with many vaccines, are just aching in the vaccine administration site, chills, rash, mild fever, nausea, loss of appetite. And really, those symptoms are only there because our immune system is working overtime, and we might feel a little sick from that. So now we're going to talk about a little bit about the vaccine pathway. So these antibodies are now abundant in the bloodstream and neutralize toxins immediately. So first, let's talk about the steps. So first, the modified form of the tetanus toxin enters the body, and the immune system immediately recognizes the toxoid as foreign. And B cells engulf this particle, they neutralize it, and they present the particle to T cells. And now these T cells activate B cells, and these B cells now produce antibodies specific to the toxin. And it's important to know that the antibodies produced are specific to the toxin and not to the bacteria itself. More on that later. Additionally, since we have these antibodies in our bloodstream, memory cells are also produced, and these enable long-term immunity. And to further this long-term immunity, we use booster shots. And these booster shots are used because our long-term immunity might be hindered over time. It's very unique that this vaccine targets only the toxins produced, not the bacteria itself. Well, like I mentioned before, the bacteria itself is not inherently harmless. It's really the toxin they produce. So really, by just attacking the toxin, we are making the vaccine a lot safer just because we're not introducing inactivated bacteria and just the toxin. So it definitely makes sense to only target the toxin. Okay. So vaccine administration follows kind of the standard protocol. So for infants and young children, The preferred site for injection is in the vastus lateralis muscle. This muscle is located in the thigh. And for older children and adults, the preferred site of injection is in that much more developed deltoid muscle. It's also important to know that there are no contraindications with this vaccine. Essentially, what that means is we don't have to worry about other vaccines being received around the same time because the two don't interfere with each other. So that's definitely helpful. So let's say we have an individual who is infected with tetanus and they are unvaccinated. Well, it's not over for them because we can provide passive immunity with something called TIG. That's just tetanus immunoglobulin. It provides short-term and immediate immunity, and we get this TIG from individuals who have already been infected with tetanus and have those antibodies. So we just extract that probably from their spinal fluid. Now, according to Penn Medicine, 25% of those untreated with tetanus to die are doomed to die, right? So it's very important that if someone isn't unvaccinated, unfortunately, that we treat them with this tetanus immunoglobulin. Otherwise, it might not end well for them. And this mortality only increases in adolescence. So the vaccine schedule for the tetanus vaccine is pretty thorough. So the CDC recommends that the vaccine should be administered once at the 2-month stage, once at the 4-month stage, once at the 6-month stage, and once from the 15 to 18-month stage, and once from the 4 to 6-year-old stage. Now, in our adolescent period, so just the period between adulthood and childhood, you only receive that once from the 11 to 12-year mark. And in adults, we get that every 10 years and after every pregnancy. And like I said before, we get those booster shots because, immune response might wane over time. So we might need just to proliferate more memory cells in our body and just increase the likelihood of not contracting tetanus. All right, so some concluding remarks. It's important to note that tetanus is a very preventable disease, and vaccination is the most effective and best way to protect against it. Now, the tetanus vaccine has been used widely for years, and it has significantly reduced the incidence of tetanus worldwide. Tetanus is no longer of grave concern. It's very treatable. In conclusion, the tetanus vaccine is a crucial tool in preventing tetanus, a potentially deadly disease, but because of recent medical advances, the bacterium Clostridium tetani is no longer dangerous. By understanding the mechanism of the disease and how the vaccine functions, we can continue to protect individuals from this serious illness. That's all I have. Thank you for watching.